So we've talked about lots of different possible types of image adjustments and manipulations, but which are acceptable and which are not? The golden rule is that any image adjustment which does not distort, hide, exaggerate, diminish, move or remove any portion of the original signal information and is evenly applied to every pixel of the original image will be acceptable for both image presentation and quantification. Other images to which adjustments that do not fulfill these criteria have been made may be used for presentation purposes only, provided that those adjustments do not alter the conclusions that may reasonably be drawn from a visual inspection of the image alone. The key is to make sure that the presented image accurately represents what is observed in the experiment. Among other things, this means that you should not adjust the display of your image in such a way as to hide faint bands, or crop out any part of the blot, such as lanes or bands you may want to ignore. You should always follow the recommendations and instructions for your particular software package, while also bearing in mind current publication guidelines for Western blots if you do intend on publishing your results. Of course, if you are going to quantify your image, then there are a couple of additional things that you're going to want to check before you proceed. The first is to verify that you don't have any signal saturation. As we discussed in the previous course about detection of your signals, this can occur when the signal from one or more of the bands, or a part of those bands, is stronger than the highest level that your detection system can possibly measure. Most software programs intended for Western blot analysis will visibly highlight saturated pixels in some way, but not always, and sometimes this feature is an option that might be disabled. Make sure that you enable it if possible, because it's important to emphasize that the relative appearance of those bands could be misleading to the viewer. The signals from saturated bands are no longer proportional to protein concentrations and should therefore never be used for quantification. The higher the dynamic range of the detection hardware, the less likely you are to experience signal saturation. So you should choose the imager with the widest dynamic range possible to avoid signal saturation altogether and obtain the highest quality data. You should also check that your imager can make full use of its dynamic range when it saves images. Without getting too technical, most imagers store images as 16-bit TIFF files, which can only store data in a 4-log range. Empiria Studio software from LICOR stores images in the equivalent of a 22-bit format, which allows data in a 6-log range to be maintained in full. If you do find that you have signal saturation in your image, don't panic. The beauty of NIR imaging is that, provided they were stored correctly, blots can be re-imaged again and again without any signal loss. You would simply image your blot again, this time with slightly reduced sensitivity or intensity settings on your imager to avoid the saturation, bearing in mind, of course, that weaker signals from the original image may not show up in the new one. If you are satisfied that you don't have any signal saturation in your image, the next thing that you should check is that you don't have the opposite problem, and that is too little signal in comparison to the background. This is where you should check the signal-to-noise ratio, or SNR, of your bands. Once you have quantified the bands using the appropriate tools in your software, you should determine the signal-to-noise ratio for each one in turn. This is calculated automatically in Empiria Studio, but you may have to work it out yourself with other software programs. The formula for SNR is the average signal for each pixel minus the average background, all divided by the background standard deviation. The general rule is that an SNR of 3 or higher is considered a reliable threshold for distinguishing signal from background noise. If the SNR is below 3, the signal for that band is too close to the background level for any meaningful conclusions to be drawn about its appearance or intensity. So we've now covered lots of factors that can affect the way that you adjust or quantify your images. But believe it or not, there are actually even more. We won't go into those here, but for further comprehensive advice on how to acquire, adjust, and analyze your images, please refer to the Data Analysis and Basic Quantification Lambda U course. Now let's go over to Jessica so you can learn about how to put all of this advice into practice.